That's just all part of the package, baby. That's just who I am. I just gotta reach down inside and...
Yes. Jak 2. Yet another Naughty Dog piece from the PlayStation 2 era, retaining its iconography to this very day, albeit for reasons drastically different from what the Precursor Legacy accomplished 2 years prior, as the Jak and Daxter series traded in its E for Everyone rating for a grueling teen rating. For some of you watching this video, myself included, this game is probably the source of many childhood nightmares not associated with the survival horror genre, as this game brought out the first bits of rage in a gamer long before the multiplayer scene made it cool years later. And while those difficult moments were haunting all those years ago, and while today, someone like myself who knows this game inside and out can handle it with ease, though it can still admittedly give me some grief, there's something to really appreciate about this particular Jak and Daxter entry, and it's easily become one of my favorite video games of all time. As stated above, Naughty Dog continued from the Precursor Legacy and traded in their E rating for a T rating, which is a trend that would continue to carry on throughout the rest of the series. This game is something that shouldn't have worked due to the risk they took with the T rating alone, since so many things were different compared to the first game, and yet, despite all the risks presented to them way back when, something remarkably unique emerged from the fruits of their labor, as they aim to expand on many things in the Jak and Daxter universe, from the gameplay formula in addition to the world itself, along with its characters, both recognizable and brand new. And they were able to commit themselves to this new path, without disconnecting themselves from where the dynamic duo came from, in more ways than one. So, what's changed in the world of Jak and Daxter after the Precursor Legacy's conclusion? Well, I'd say there's no time like the present, and I'm happy to walk all of you through it since it ended up being quite the wild ride. So, all that being said, let's get into it, shall we? While I've been emphasizing a point regarding the Precursor Legacy and Jak 2 being completely different from one another, it does not necessarily mean that you need to discard the muscle memory you may have learned throughout Jak's journey from Geyser Rock and Sandover Village to Gol Maia Citadel. Every move you've used throughout Jak 1 are all still here, and function exactly the same as you'd remember, albeit with one exception here in Jak 2. Concerning the roll jump having no effect on enemies this time around. So you'll just have to make do with every individual attack, along with their combinations with Jak's jumping abilities. And to many fans' surprise, Daxter also gets a brief opportunity to shine both here with a moveset identical to Jak's and elsewhere in other areas of the game, aiding Jak on his journey. Along with the same combat moves and abilities Jak remembers from his days as a young hero, the Zoomer returns once again, albeit in a more widely available manner this time around, as it's conjoined with the new explorable world of Haven City streets. Compared to Keira's original design, these new Zoomers come with new features such as a more controllable structure, greater speeds via boosted jet engine, better brake handling, and 2 additional flight modes that allow you to switch between low and high altitudes at a time. Great care, however, would have to be practiced by a player, especially on lighter, more faster vehicles compared to the standard heavier ones, since it's possible to wreck your vehicle if you collide with something at high velocities. For all vehicles, however, early signs that you should get off and switch to another vehicle, all Grand Theft Auto style, is if your vehicle starts to smoke and catch fire, with the worst condition being signified by a vehicle no longer able to travel at a normal speed. While watching for your vehicle's condition, you'd also have to be mindful when switching between low and high hover zones, since down below, injuring civilians or Crimson Guards on patrol may result in the city's alarm going off and prompting the guards to focus on hunting Jak down, followed by the city's automated turret system activating as well. The same goes for up above, since you'd have to be mindful of Crimson Guard cruisers passing by, since you wouldn't want them coming after you either. After all, you wouldn't want to have your health depleted before a mission starts. There is admittedly one good trick to take out Crimson Guards without setting anything off. A little bit cheeky, but it works. By hovering over an unsuspecting guard patrolling the streets from ground level, dismounting from a vehicle, and letting the vehicle fall on top of the guard will take him out after a few hits. There's probably no real reason to do this other than I found it amusing to experiment with. While you really only get a clip of ammunition from the guard that perishes as a result, there are admittedly better ways to gather ammunition before missions. Speaking of missions, your transportation and your freedom is admittedly a bit limited at first, since for the game's beginning, only one mission will become available at a time, as some parts of the city aren't accessible to Jak if he doesn't have the correlating checkpoint pass. But as time passes and more parts of the city become unlocked and Jak gains more abilities and other upgrades for his new equipment, leniency will return to the game's story, similarly to how you could make the choice of what missions you'd like to travel to and tackle first, just like in the first game, be it within the city's walls or beyond. And just like the first game, if you know beforehand what missions you can take first before another, it will benefit greatly, since the rewards from said missions can be great assets for the mission or missions you may have decided to hold off on for later. With regards to health comes yet another surprising change. Unlike Naughty Dog's previous 3-hit and 50 green eco cluster system back in the first game, now it's a full health sphere placed with 8 slots instead of 3. Sounds great, right? Truthfully, since most enemies with the exception of smaller enemies you encounter dish out 2 points of damage, the increase to health remains somewhat of an illusion, as enemies can kill Jak in a mere 4 hits. Now, I wouldn't really fret about this, since you don't really take damage when in vehicles around the city, and Jak has a lot more at his disposal this time around in combination with his melee attacks. Speaking of which, guns. Let's talk guns, shall we? The closest we've come to this kind of shooting gameplay in the past was through Jak channeling yellow eco throughout the Precursor Legacy and shooting fireballs out of his hands. This time around, guns that are seemingly inspired by past eco types, red representing strength up close, yellow representing precise and balanced shots, blue representing speed and quick thinking, and purple lastly being an embodiment of unhinged destruction, are all presented chronologically along with any additional upgrades as the story progresses, from the scattergun, blaster, Vulcan Fury, and Peacemaker. And as specified, using these 4 weapons is in tandem with Jak's melee abilities, most notably the spin kick. There's just something very satisfying, even to this day, about spinning into an enemy and firing 3 shots automatically after. Hell, even better, jumping into the air, spinning, and shooting in multiple directions with the blaster, which does also work with the scattergun. And the Vulcan Fury instantly fires too. It's honestly a lot more enjoyable than having stagnant gameplay in a turret section, which this game also has. I just enjoy moving around with Jak more than being still, you know? Now, something that remains as an interesting element that wraps itself into this game and the weapons is the dynamic music. Unlike before, where it focused more on the location and the different obstacles within them, this time around, it's more centered around Jak and his actions, such as when he equips a weapon or has his jetboard out, which is also another thing I have to talk about in a minute. But continuing with the music for a moment, besides some additional elements added on to certain levels tracks, the most standout and probably the most intimidating example of this is definitely the previously mentioned Haven City Pursuit, if you pester Crimson Guards or citizens. Now, with the jetboard I just mentioned, this thing is an absolute blast. It's not an ideally faster method of transport if you just want to get around Haven City, but it's quite the exhilarating one, especially when I know I could get hurt by simply colliding with a guard pursuing me. Though I think there's a very specific way to avoid taking damage by just jumping at the right time in front of a guard, as opposed to jumping right into them head on. The jetboard is also very useful for soaking up ammunition from Crimson Guard crates. Say you wanted to replenish your stock before going on a critical mission you know will be heavily reliant on your guns. Simply running through the crates on top of the jetboard will allow Jak to take them all in quickly and conveniently, versus picking them all up manually. Not that it takes that long, but it's certainly still something worth noting regardless. And finally, as we get close to wrapping up Jak 2's gameplay discussion, there's a few other heavier things I've yet to mention, but are still awesome additions worth going over. Dark Jak is a twisted dark eco-induced version of Jak that allows him to summon dark eco powers to enhance his melee abilities, in addition to gaining other abilities meant to induce high damage to enemies in a large radius. Dark Jak attacks really differently, such as instead of punching his enemies, he'll claw right through them. The one downside to this is I wish it lasted a little bit longer, but other than that, it's kind of indulging seeing enemies crumble from the impact of, say, a dark bomb. And lastly, there's the Titan suit, something that shows up in very specific missions, having limited mobility. But what makes up for it even more is the sheer power the suit possesses, from the ability to crash through brick walls to the ability to lift heavy bricks in order to... well, smash through another brick wall. Sometimes, however, it's necessary to dismount from the suit for a couple of reasons, such as clearing out certain enemies, since ranged attacks can prove lethal to the suit itself, and making jumps that the suit couldn't make otherwise, while you focus on clearing a path for it to travel on. And I know this isn't as rage-inducing or nightmarish as that one mission in the slums, but there's one mission in the Titan suit that wasn't necessarily hard back then, but it did admittedly jolt up my anxiety while playing, as I aimed to keep the suit functional while under pressurized water. It was a scary and intimidating thing to overcome at the time, but reaping the rewards was well worth the obstacles that lay in my way. So, I just about covered everything I possibly could regarding Jak's gameplay, from what got preserved from the first game to the new additions, earning this game its T for Teen rating. Now it's time to discuss an even more interesting aspect, the story depicting Jak and Daxter's own respective obstacles they've had to surmount in this new setting the player navigates through. And regardless of the drastically different style from Jak's 1 and 2, this ambitious sequel is closer to home than you think. The story following Jak and Daxter collecting their 100th power cell and placing each artifact inside all 100 holes on the precursor door above Gol Maia's citadel is a very interesting and intriguing one. Jak 2's opening is quick to acknowledge where everything began, panning through Sandover Village as we get a glimpse of all the characters we've been introduced to and traveled with in the Precursor Legacy, followed by yet another glimpse of this giant shining object brought all the way from Gol Maia's citadel to home, and glimpses of this vessel all the characters sit down in, with everything in place as Jak and the others continue to progress on discovering the relations between their Rift Rider and the giant shining precursor ring they retrieved from the top of the citadel. Things immediately begin to take a dark turn. Literally. The bright, warming atmosphere cast by the sun, which maintains Sandover Village's colorful atmosphere during the day in the first game, begins to retreat as the sky is shrouded in darkness, followed by swarms of flying creatures we'd come to know as metalheads, along with a bigger creature who we can assume is their leader. In a panic, unsure of what to do, Jak presses the artifact he just pressed moments ago a second time, and now the Rift Rider pulls our beloved Precursor Legacy cast into the ring. Where they land next after a major accident that caused the Rift Rider to implode mid-flight, Jak and Daxter are still being flung towards the light, while Samos and Keira become separated both from them and one another. For our heroes, as the ride finally comes to a conclusive crash, it only takes one gaze up to realize that where it is they've landed is not the comforting little green village they once called home, now trapped, surrounded by this seemingly vast wall of steel and concrete as far as both can see, followed by, of course, a giant palace that overshadows this new city from above. Men in red armor, the Crimson Guard, along with their commander Errol, move in to secure Jak for their own purposes. Before they could even get to what they had in mind for the young hero, the first complimentary greeting this new city's enforcement officers had were, well, let's just say they left quite the impact. 2 years following these events, after undergoing some cruel Dark Eco experimentation for a Dark Warrior program, approved by the city's current ruler, Baron Praxis, as Daxter prepares to enter the picture, while Praxis and Errol take their leave, we get to see a major change in our previously mute hero. The look on his face, along with his first line of dialogue, says it all, vowing revenge on the man that subjected him to the torture and experimentation that caused Jak to change dramatically, as Daxter attempted to unlock him from the table. I'm sure Naughty Dog intended for players to see this. Jak's Dark Eco form, along with his gray skin, almost reminds me of Gol Maia to an extent. Needless to say, with the introduction of this new setting and characters, combined with our hero speaking with such ferocity and contempt, this was Naughty Dog's clever and explicit way to tell the players that this game and our characters would be nothing like we've experienced before on their previous adventures, and they're able to continue on this path of easing us into this world through a simple representation of something similar, yet now, according to Daxter, has become scarce and isn't as widely available as it was before, which gives a player like me an idea of a sense of desperation this world is experiencing. As I mentioned, you could find many precursor orbs in the last game, but considering the orbs were used for trade even back then, one could assume that in this new setting, that they were also used for trade, and people in this world would probably do anything to get their hands on this now rare artifact. This feeling I get of Haven City's world, even from something as simple as precursor orb rarity, is especially reinforced by how claustrophobic Haven City streets feel compared to the Precursor Legacy's play space. There's a lot more people around compared to the villages Jak lived in and even traveled through, so I wouldn't doubt that in this world, resources, especially eco, is something that has dwindled substantially. And as proven by continued story progression, that continues to be true, which is very troubling for certain characters. And when you combine that with the merciless establishment of law enforcers keeping the city's streets safe, in air quotes, as they order anyone who isn't above suspicion in their eyes to surrender and die instead of surrender or die, you get quite the intimidating feel of what Haven City was like compared to where Jak grew up in. Mind you, Jak could have no problem fending for himself, and with his old pal Daxter by his side again, he felt like he could take on anything and anyone, including Baron Praxis. After all, he's taken on a great challenge before, and Jak was making damn sure that he'd do it again, especially with his new powers. This, however, did not start out as a noble quest, and Keira nor Samos were on Jak's mind, due to his rage that gave him a new perspective on how to fight in this new world. He may have once been concerned with saving the world, but now, as he's blinded by his vengeance and rage, all he's concerned for at the moment is gathering all the resources he could muster over time, and he would do anything to get at the man he swore revenge on, consuming Jak to the core, as he risked losing the qualities that remained deep within his soul that once made him who he was before, as he attempted to survive this world. To fans of Naughty Dog's most recent works, this statement may be something that sounds somewhat familiar to you, as Naughty Dog used similar themes that drove one of their recently concocted stories they recently released in the final years of the PlayStation 4's generation. And while I don't wish to turn this review into a comparison video, to an extent, I can see where Naughty Dog replicated that same idea of turning one's world upside down and inside out, and revenge from Jak 2 into The Last of Us Part 2. Even if Jak was motivated by his vengeance similar to Ellie, and both have had their forms of support, this game does things a lot differently, since while Ellie had to live with and make peace with the hand she's been dealt, Jak has a chance to reclaim the heroic qualities he thought that he'd lost. Though that doesn't mean that this installment in the Jak series had no room for humor, nor did it omit any chance of it being a good time. Jak may not be able to return to the world he thought to have called home anytime soon, but he can take the steps to do what he can in this one. One of his first calls to action was through meeting Cor as soon as he escaped the Crimson Fortress. Cor commended Jak for doing a brave thing by shielding him and a young boy from Crimson Guards, which prompted Cor to recommend Jak for an underground movement, fighting to take down the very man Jak was also gunning for. When he makes it to the Underground's hideout, Torn is one man who will eventually start out as a new support structure for Jak's world, as he tests this new face to see if they were worthy for joining their movement or not. Said test, however, would absolutely be no problem, since, after all, Jak surmounted equally difficult paths to get to power cells on his previous adventure, though characters like Torn likely would have been uninterested in hearing of these past endeavors, so Jak would just have to show him instead. Power cells and dance celebrations were not going to be a common practice anymore, but their resilience and abilities were commendable enough for Torn and his no-nonsense, rugged nature he still attains from his days in the Crimson Guard, to provide Jak for tasks to slowly but surely cripple the foundations of Baron Praxis and his rule with whatever angle he could find, since he's been on the inside. And while this may be the case for many instances going forward, since Jak doesn't mind charging into certain danger to hurt the Baron, that doesn't mean that this game forgets about where these two started, which I think is a nice touch, and brings me back to a simpler time before things got dark and complicated in this universe. and while fighting Baron Praxis with the missions Jack's given is easy for him. What start to become a complication is his different allegiances that he takes on, along with the people they come across, be it characters that are in it for their own interests, or people trying to do the right thing as they aid Jack and others with their wisdom and guidance. Others that Jack meets, meanwhile, end up being caught in the middle, each of their technical and combat skills, along with varying degrees of courage, aiding in the conflict, both against what's out beyond Haven's walls and Praxis. Things may have been black and white once upon a time, and it was easy to know who the enemy was back then, but now, things have changed tremendously, and in many cases going forward, they'd have to adapt and accept the changes to stay afloat together, or be left behind. And sometimes, Jack will occasionally end up being trapped into doing certain actions, as he's compliant with going along with things, just as long as he gets his new weapons to fight Baron Praxis with. And it's not just Jack who's experienced this under crew's employment. Good people will end up going down a dark path they'll end up regretting. Take Sig, for example, one of crew's right-hand men, and a wastelander that Jack ends up working and training with. In his case, he may have once stuck with his motto, shoot first, ask questions later, but there eventually comes a time for people like Sig, including Jack, where questions do come first over action, as they stop to think about why they're doing the things they're doing, and what agendas their employers may be omitting from them, while they make a valiant effort to focus on themselves and the answers they seek for the many questions they have. Inevitably, Jak and Daxter's many diverging paths will lead them back to the original Precursor Legacy cast. One may think that this calls for a celebration, but considering how much Jak has changed and what he's been getting himself into ever since they've been forcefully separated from one another, old friends like Keira will think differently of Jak, since they believe they can barely recognize the hero they once felt affection for. To add insult to injury, since Jak's been gone, Keira ended up almost, if not closely, falling for one of the men responsible for Jak's imprisonment and experimentation. And you can imagine how ugly that bitter rivalry would have gotten, especially since Errol is in it to win and shove it in Jak's face that Keira and the city are his. Jak, on the other hand, doesn't just roll over and take that. Thankfully, to audience members like myself, there's a relief in knowing that the contempt Keira and Jak risked developing from one another doesn't last forever. So that's Keira, but how do things fare with our beloved cranky Green Eco Sage Samos? After all, it was Samos that was always being hard on the boys back then, but that praise that Samos developed for the duo after Gol Maia's defeat has never been swayed despite their 2-year separation. Matter of fact, one could say after putting a couple pieces together concerning some very mind-blowing twists Naughty Dog put in as they connected Jak back to the Precursor Legacy, that he's always believed in them and knew certain things were going to happen. To further back up this point as I get into Samos' significance in this game, along with the twist, by the time you reunite with the Samos of old, you'd remember from the Precursor Legacy and Jak 2's opening, you'd have already met another Samos, a younger version. This Samos is in fact the same Samos who mentored Jak way back when, but due to things that this Samos has already seen, such as Daxter as an Otzel for example, it ties into how unsurprised he's seen when the boys went to seek help from him after Misty Island. It's almost like back then, he was waiting for Daxter to inevitably transform into an Otzel so he could send them off on their adventure, since he already met him back in Haven City's future. And let me just mention real quick that the performance the late Warren Burton provided to both versions of Samos Haggai was just perfect. The younger Samos still sounds recognizable, enough for me to know that this is Samos, but the way he played into the part, along with the direction I imagine Naughty Dog guided, is this Samos sounds slightly more youthful and hot-headed, while the older Samos maintains that rugged, wise, and admittedly semi-grumpy personality that he's maintained from the past. And since the past is inevitably a destination that the young Samos must trek back towards, it's down to the older Samos to ensure that everything that he'd previously prepared for happened, and that his younger counterpart is ready in order to set up events from the Precursor Legacy, which of course leads older Samos back to the future, so Jak and Daxter could progress in what they were meant to do in Jak 2. But for the present, the characters are experiencing in this game, seeing the two Samoses banter, argue, and clash with one another is hysterical every time I play this game and never gets old. I know it's a lot to wrap your head around, but trust me, that "find yourself, Jak" line makes even more sense by the time you realize who it is you're dealing with. And if you were to ask me, if this game was done with any major story twist, I'd respond with, well, strap in, cause we're going for a ride. Remember Core? Well, turns out he's not all he claimed to be, and he's been double-crossing us all this time. But wait, how did we even get here? Well, just like what I discussed with Samos, everything ties back to the Precursor Legacy's ending and Jak 2's beginning, and the events that preceded after. And putting this into perspective, our first meeting with Core was not when Jak escaped from the prison and went out into the streets of Haven City, but when the Rift Gate was activated back in Sandover Village. I don't know how true this is in relation to the existence of the Metalheads and the implication of how long the Precursors have dwelled on the planet, but supposedly, the Metalheads were let out by Jak when the ring was activated. And yet, what's somewhat confusing about that point is, the Precursors and Metalheads have waged wars for eons, so they claim. I don't know when or how the Precursors have waged war against Core and his Metal Menace, nor do I know how long they've been in the Rift Gate prior to Jak unlocking it. Inquiries aside, what I really appreciate about this twist is, regardless of if you saw it coming or not, when playing this another time and you're able to watch over the cutscenes again, you can see every individual and deliberate implication of Core's true nature under the feeble act he portrayed to others. While I was thinking something wasn't right, I myself didn't exactly figure it out on my first playthrough all those years ago, before the twist was revealed. But I really enjoyed going back and seeing how Naughty Dog were hinting at said twist of Core being the Metalhead leader, especially considering how eager and menacing he seemed regarding the Precursor Stone. Though looking back at it, and it does seem to also somewhat apply to crew as well, the missions Core sent us out on may have also been for the purpose of crippling the Baron's resources, but said resources were part of what was needed to keep the Metalheads at bay, and little did everyone know, their plans set all of the characters up, which they were not thrilled to find out about. Plus, the limit to which the Metalheads' terror reigned were not limited to any factions in this game, regardless of how much they contributed to either side. Everyone, from all sides, Crimson Guard, Underground, Jak, etc., were all trapped together inside of Haven's walls after Core's sabotage. Even the Baron was not exempt from this, and this situation brings to light the Baron's ultimate role in the story and his place within it. He may have always acted against Jak and those who opposed him, and despite his power-hungry declaration of how he believes he was the hero of the story, an agenda he's always tried to remain loyal to was protecting Haven City, albeit in his own twisted way, shown through other actions like putting Jak through the Dark Warrior program and the deals he's made with Core. But in the end, it was up to Jak to finish what had begun 2 years prior, with a chance to save the city, be a hero again, and maybe go home to a more peaceful and stable time. Though fate had a funny way of displaying its direction to our heroes, since coinciding with the reveal of Core's true identity is the young kid that's kept close to Core's side throughout the game. While the younger Samos was unaware of how important the kid was, beyond opening the tomb of Mar, the older Samos knew that this young kid, the supposed lost heir to Haven City, would grow up to be the very Jak we knew back in the Precursor Legacy, with Core even being aware of Jak's past. He explains how this was done for the purpose of getting Jak ready to one day battle and defeat Core to save Haven City, and considering how the Tomb of Mar's trials could only be surmounted by the skills Jak had learned, it's almost endearing to look back at that scene in retrospect, since Jak almost appeared to be in a trance, stepping towards the door, despite everyone expecting the kid to go into the tomb. And this was no accident, since he was meant to be there and pass those trials in order to gain access to the Precursor Stone. In the end, however, despite all the odds and dangers Haven City faced with the Metalhead invasion, Jak was able to fulfill the destiny Samos had thought out for him ever since he watched over him back in Sandover Village, which is a place that Jak and everyone else for that matter had to give up, so the previously mentioned Samos and Jak could return to the past, so he may go from that young boy afraid of everything that's around him and transform into the young hero that eventually defeated Gol Maia, who in turn eventually saved Haven City. Despite the door to the past being closed up, completing the cycle, while simultaneously paving the way for what Jak had already been through. There's a few last little bits of seeds planted by Naughty Dog meant to incite curiosity a year prior to their inevitable next game. We will meet again, said the projection of a precursor, and Samos had a feeling while celebrating their victory in Haven City that they were destined to eventually meet the legendary Mar, commenting how this man may be closer than they think. You don't say, huh, Samos? So, despite all the new elements that could have potentially worked against Naughty Dog from both achieving their new vision and maintaining a connection to their predecessor, Jak 2 turned out to be quite the amazing adventure that was unafraid to embrace what it was, while still acknowledging in subtle and explicit ways where they started. The additions to the Jak and Daxter gameplay formula, like the guns, jetboard, and Dark Jak, were very interesting and fun to play with, and the story itself along with its characters were able to portray the dark and complex themes they were trying to highlight effectively. And of course, I can't forget those twists I mentioned moments ago regarding the tie-ins to the Precursor Legacy, in addition to how they handled the characterization. I knew going into this review that this game was going to be a treat to speak on, but now that I finished going over the details of the ins and outs of this game, I feel even more grateful that this was a game I got to experience in my childhood, regardless of its maturity level. With that, we finally come to the end of the video. If you've been here up to this point, I wanted to first thank you all for tuning in. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of the new direction Jak and Daxter decided to take in the sequel. Did you like it? Did you hate it? You know, anything goes. Just for some major content updates, since I'm now finished this review and Jak month is starting to wrap up, I'm aiming to have my Jak 3 review out before that said event wraps up. So if you want to stick around for that or any other future videos, consider subscribing to the channel and pledging to me on Patreon, where I'll be posting things like previews to future content such as the Jak 3 review and granting patrons access to a Discord server. So once again, thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Until next time everyone, take care and farewell.